Modern World History students. We're continuing on with unit number 6, the First World War, and this is section number 9, the entry of the United States. And some of you may have been kind of waiting for this, like you might know that the United States was a part of the First World War, but we've had several lessons now, and the United States isn't in, and you're not hearing about the United States, and we're talking about a war going on, and still no word about the United States. Well, today's lesson is actually about why the United States entered the war. And I hope that you'll be able to explain why the United States did not enter the war earlier, even after the sinking of a ship called the Lusitania, and why they did eventually enter the war almost 2 years later over basically the same issue. So you'll hear about the British naval blockade, and you'll learn who President Woodrow Wilson was. We'll talk about the meaning of neutrality, and then you'll hear about that ship, the Lusitania, and its story. Finally, we'll discuss the Sussex Pledge and how that prevented the United States from entering the war after the sinking of the Lusitania, until the Germans resumed what was called unrestricted submarine warfare. So let's get started. I'm at the top of page 16, and I need to give you a little bit of background on the entry of the United States into the war before we talk about the specific events that led to that. So there was really only one major naval battle of the war. It was called the Battle of Jutland, and Jutland is the peninsula where the country of Denmark is located. So it sticks right up out of the north part of Germany into what's called the Baltic Sea. The Battle of Jutland pitted the sort of reigning champs of naval supremacy, that is the British Navy, the Royal Navy, against the up-and-coming challengers, the German Imperial Navy. You might remember that in the years prior to the war, one of the issues that was raising tensions in Europe was the fact that Kaiser Wilhelm II was determined to build up Germany's navy to the point where it could challenge the British Navy for its supremacy. Well, the Battle of Jutland pitted then the British against the Germans. I don't want to say a lot about this battle. For what it's worth, the Germans performed very well. As a matter of fact, they outmaneuvered the British during the battle. And the Germans actually inflicted more damage, sank more shipping of the British fleet than the British sank of the German fleet. So you could call it a tactical victory for the Germans. The Germans won the battle. Here was the problem, though. Despite all of Kaiser Wilhelm's efforts, the German Navy was still considerably smaller than Britain's Royal Navy. And even though the Germans had inflicted more damage on the British than the British had on them, the damage that the Germans sustained was still very significant, and it had a bigger impact on the German Navy's overall strength, because the German Navy was smaller than the British Navy. Though the British sustained more damage in this battle, they were large enough that they just kind of absorbed the losses and were still quite strong. The German Navy, in the meantime, was not as large, and the damages that they suffered, although less than the British, they couldn't afford. They couldn't simply absorb it. And so the battle was a tactical victory for the Germans. But in terms of the overall strategy of the war, it was a strategic defeat for the Germans because their navy was now rendered incapable of really challenging the British fleet for control of the seas. For the remainder of the war, the German Navy had to retreat back into its own ports and basically guard the coasts right outside of Germany to protect Germany. They could not hope to go out onto the high seas and challenge the British for supremacy for the remainder of the war. And so that's a kind of a strange thing. When is a victory not a victory? Well, that's an example of how that can happen. What that meant then for the British was that they could, having asserted their naval supremacy even in defeat, they could now blockade Germany's ports. And really the ports of all of these central powers, not just Germany's ports, but Austria-Hungary's ports and the Ottoman Empire's ports as well. So let's talk about what that means. Think about how during times of war, especially in the modern era, in the last 100, 120 years, In times of war, the economy of a country at war is very disrupted. Think about agriculture and how when you draft hundreds of thousands of soldiers into an army, you're pulling a lot of them out of the fields. And so food production goes down. When you are putting a lot of your resources into building up an army and a navy, putting a lot of your labor into building up an army and a navy, and at the same time still having to provide manufactured goods for your civilian population, it puts a real strain on manufacturing as well. And so countries at war oftentimes rely on acquiring resources from other countries, from their allies, or from what are called neutral countries, countries not in the war. So countries at war oftentimes will try to acquire food from other countries and bring it in cargo ships, merchant ships. They'll try to acquire resources from other countries and bring it in cargo ships. They'll try to acquire manufactured goods, including war materials, including uniforms and boots and tents and guns and bullets, which are manufactured in other countries, and bring it in cargo ships. Well, if you have a strong navy, a dominant navy like the British, what you can do is you can prevent your enemies from being able to do that through use of what's called a naval blockade, like you see here. What the British did was they positioned their ships, they positioned their navy outside of all of Germany's ports. And their ships would then deny any cargo ship entry into the German ports so that Germany and its allies, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, could not receive food or resources or manufactured goods from other countries. The British Navy had locked their ports down so that cargo ships, merchant ships, could not come and go from those ports. That's the point of a naval blockade. And the British naval blockade, which progressed from the Battle of Jutland onward against the Central Powers, against Germany and Germany's allies, was extremely effective. By the end of the war, Germany could not feed its civilian population, much less its army. 400,000 German civilians died of starvation and malnutrition because the Germans were not able to acquire enough food to feed their population. Now, some of that was also because the German government did a horrible job of managing their food supply and food distribution, but a lot of it was due to the very effective British naval blockade. So the British were blockading the ports of Germany and the Central Powers to prevent them from acquiring the things they needed to carry out the war successfully. So where does the United States come in? Well, it comes in because the Germans were then sort of retaliating against the British by trying to do the same thing to them, but in a different way. So the German surface fleet, we mean ships that sail on the top of the water, was not strong enough to challenge and overcome the British naval blockade. But the Germans were working with a technology that was not entirely new during World War I, but they had perfected it. The Germans had perfected this technology in a way that was new by the time of World War I. These are submarines. And this was when we did our lesson on the impact of new technologies. This is one I wasn't able to get to. But this is a good time to get to it anyway. In German, the word submarine is Unterseeboot, which is a reminder to us that German is a language where a lot of the very simple words sound a lot like very simple words in English. And if you know some of those simple words, a lot of German words are they're very linear structure where you string simple words together to make a more complex word. So Unterseeboot, undersea boat, submarine. You might wonder why the German language and the English language have so many similarities. And it has to do with the fact that back in the early medieval period, Germanic tribes called the Angles and Saxons invaded England and took over parts of England. And so the English language is very much influenced by Germanic languages. So, Unterseeboot, undersea boat, submarine. Now, it's true that submarines had been around at least since the time of the War of American Independence. American patriots had actually destroyed a British warship in New York Harbor in the 1770s using a submarine called the Terrible Turtle. But by now, these submarines were quite different. 140 years later, 130 years later, these submarines were quite different. These submarines ran on a diesel engine, which, when surfaced, could be used to charge up a battery. So when the submarine was surfaced running under the power of its diesel engine, it was also charging its battery. And when the submarine wanted to submerge, then the battery took over and could run the submarine's engine, the submarine's motor, for several hours. And so the submarine could stay then submerged for several hours until it ran out of battery power, at which point it would again have to surface and run its diesel engine. So the submarine was a hybrid, basically, kind of like operating the same principle as a hybrid car. The thing that allowed submarines to surface and submerge was that they had big tanks called ballast tanks. And when those tanks were empty, full of air, the submarine surfaced. And when they wanted the submarine to submerge, they would open up little doors that would allow water to go into the tanks. And once water was partially filled the tanks or fully filled the tanks, the submarine would submerge and go down under the surface. And so by adjusting the amount of water in the ballast tanks, you could have the submarine at the surface or just a little below the surface or deeper. When you wanted to surface again, you pump the water out of the tanks and it would come back up. So that's how these submarines worked. They used their capacity to move underwater to launch surprise attacks against enemy ships. And there were really two ways that a submarine could attack and destroy an enemy ship. One way was to surface and use what's called a deck gun. So this is a deck gun right here, and it sits on the deck of the submarine. When the submarine was surfaced, the crew could come out and they could load and fire the deck gun, and they could launch high explosive shells to try to strike an enemy ship. And if you couldn't sink it, you could at least disable it, destroy its engines, its propellers, so that it couldn't continue to go. The other way that a German submarine, or any submarine, could attack and destroy an enemy ship was by launching what's called a torpedo. And a torpedo is a sort of an underwater missile. It has its own engine, it has its own motor, and it has a propeller which propels it through the water, and it has an explosive tip. And when the torpedo strikes, that's what you're seeing here. When the torpedo strikes an enemy ship below the waterline, it blows a big hole in the ship's hull, water rushes in, and the ship sinks. So those are two different ways that a submarine can attack and destroy an enemy ship. Generally speaking, submarines preyed upon enemy merchant ships, certainly in the case of the German submarines, because the British were trying to deny the Germans access to trade with the world by use of their blockade. The Germans now were going to try to deny the British and the French too access to trade with the world by using their submarines. So the submarines generally attacked merchant ships, cargo ships. The other reason why submarines preyed mostly on merchant ships or cargo ships was they're not heavily armed. They don't carry weapons, and they don't have big, thick armor plating. Enemy warships do have that kind of armor plating. They're a lot harder to sink. But a cargo ship isn't designed for that, and so it's a lot easier to sink a cargo ship. And for the Germans, that was their main goal anyway, to deprive the British and French of access to food or resources or manufactured goods that they needed to fight the war. Generally speaking, the way that this would work is if the commander of a German submarine saw that a cargo ship was not, or a group of cargo ships were not accompanied by enemy warships, you say, well, how would they see? Well, they have what's called a periscope, which is a tube that sticks up out of the water, and it has lenses and mirrors that allows the submarine commander to see above the surface of the water, even when the submarine is submerged. So if an enemy commander or if a German commander would see that enemy cargo ships were not accompanied by warships, in all likelihood, the submarine commander would bring the submarine to the surface and blast away with the deck gun. because a submarine only had so many torpedoes, and if you could destroy an enemy ship or disable an enemy ship using the deck gun, that was preferable. If, however, there were enemy warships in the area, then the submarine would attack with torpedoes, would remain submerged and attack with torpedoes. Because submarines are also not heavily armed. A submarine can't have heavy, thick armor on it because it would make it too difficult for the submarine to submerge and surface. Submarines have very thin, relatively thin armor. And so one good shot from an enemy cannon, deck gun, will sink a submarine and kill its crew. So if there were enemy warships in the area, generally a submarine commander would remain submerged and attack using torpedoes, and then after launching the attack, submerge further and get out of there. So that gives you a basic idea of how submarine warfare worked during the First World War. And so, within the first year of the war, German submarines were attacking British and French cargo ships on the Atlantic Ocean, carrying war supplies, in order to try to deprive the British and French of access to those war supplies. Where were the British and French getting their war supplies? Mostly from the United States. The United States, by 1914, by the outbreak of the First World War, had surpassed Britain as the world's leading manufacturing country, the world's leading industrial power. And so, when the war began, no one could crank out materials, peace materials or war materials, like the United States could. The President of the United States, whom you see over there on the right, President Woodrow Wilson, did not want the United States to be involved in the war. He perhaps correctly calculated just how horrible this war was going to be, but maybe just more importantly, he understood that war is a massive disruption in the life of a country and in the economy of a country. And he didn't want the United States to subject itself to that when we didn't really have to. We had an ocean separating us from what was going on in Europe, the Atlantic Ocean. And so at the beginning of the war, President Wilson declared the United States to be neutral, meaning that we weren't taking sides. We weren't on the side of the Allied powers. We weren't on the side of the Central powers. We were neutral. Now, when a country is neutral, generally speaking, that should mean that they could trade. They should be allowed to trade with anybody in the war. And as a matter of fact, that was the position of the US government, that American companies could sell manufactured goods, even war materials, to Britain and France, or to Germany and Austria-Hungary. We were neutral. We weren't taking sides. Now, the reality was that it wasn't possible for American companies to sell war materials to the Germans because of the British naval blockade. The British naval blockade made it impossible for German cargo ships to get out, to come to the United States and purchase American war materials. This made Americans unhappy. As a matter of fact, at the beginning of our involvement, not our involvement, at the beginning of the war, Britain was quite unpopular in the United States because of the naval blockade. American companies were certainly making lots of money selling war materials to Britain and France, but they could have made even more money had they been able to sell to Germany as well. But because of the British naval blockade, that wasn't possible. People also didn't like it on principle. Why should the British be allowed to tell us who we could and couldn't trade with? That was the cause of the War of 1812. Same thing, 100 years earlier, British interfering with American trade when the United States was a neutral country. And we'd gone to war with the British over that back then. So honestly, at the beginning, the first year of the war or so, American public opinion was split, on whether to support the Allies, including the British and the French, or to support Germany. But mainly, the American public supported neutrality, staying out of the war completely. That changed. American public opinion began to turn sharply against the Germans in May of 1915. Because in May of 1915, a German submarine sank a passenger ship carrying 1,500 plus passengers. This was a British ship. It was a British passenger ship, and it was called the Lusitania. It was on its way from New York to Britain. And when the German submarine sank it, um, over 1,200 people were killed. The reason why so many were killed was that the ship sank very quickly. The Lusitania sank very quickly. It sank in, this newspaper headline from the New York Times indicates 15 minutes. I think probably more accurate is 20 to 25 minutes, but still very fast. If you know something about the Titanic, the big ship that had struck an iceberg and sunk 3 years prior to this in 1912, it took the Titanic hours to sink. The Lusitania sank very quickly in 20 to 25 minutes, which is why so many people were killed. Unlike the Titanic, the Lusitania had plenty of lifeboats. Cruise lines had learned their lesson from the Titanic to ensure that there were plenty of lifeboats. The problem was they couldn't get the lifeboats launched because the Lusitania sank so quickly. That's why so many people died. The reason why the Lusitania sank so quickly was that there were really two explosions on board the Lusitania. The first one happened when the German torpedo slammed into the hull and exploded. But then there was a second explosion. And while at the time they blamed this on a second German torpedo, it turns out that the second explosion was an internal explosion. Some of the cargo in the hold of the Lusitania exploded and blasted a hole in the hull of the ship from the inside, which is part of the reason it sank so quickly. Why did the cargo of the Lusitania explode? Because it included artillery shells and gunpowder that was bound for Britain. So what happened there? This is a passenger ship. Well, passenger ships had plenty of room in their cargo holds for all of the luggage, the baggage that was being carried by the passengers. They would carry trunks full of clothing and things like that. But there was always extra space on board. And so what the cruise lines did is they would sell that extra space to companies that needed to transport goods that had been purchased by overseas customers. And so what had happened with the Lusitania was an American munitions company, a company making artillery shells and gunpowder, had sold some of their products to the British government. They had purchased the space, the extra space on board the Lusitania to transport those to Britain. The Germans knew it. The Germans had an extensive spy network in the United States, even though we were not yet at war. The Germans knew that the Lusitania was carrying armaments, and so the Germans targeted the ship with their submarines. For what it's worth, the Germans took an advertisement in the New York newspapers warning Americans not to board the Lusitania. And as a matter of fact, that is part of the reason why, of the over 1,200 dead, roughly 10% of them were Americans. About 130, 140 Americans died when the Lusitania sank. But the Germans had warned Americans not to board the Lusitania, that this was a targeted ship and it was subject to be sunk by submarines. And it was. Now, despite all of that, public opinion turned very sharply against Germany in the United States because of the sinking of the Lusitania. Even if a relatively small number of Americans had died, it was seen as an act of great brutality on the part of Germany. And remember that the British had already been using German atrocities committed against the Belgian people during the German invasion of Belgium to propagandize the American people, to try to turn public opinion in the United States against the Germans. Well, this act was much more powerful in doing that. And there was a sense amongst Americans that the Germans had committed this act of great brutality and that the United States should now join the war on the side of the Allies, of Britain and France. So American public opinion turned sharply against the Germans for the sinking of the Lusitania. However, President Wilson still did not, and many, many Americans also, still did not believe that the best thing for the United States was to join the war. By now, the war had been going on for a year, and the reality of this war was already setting in, that this was a catastrophic experience for everyone involved in battles with hundreds of thousands, potentially, of casualties. And so President Wilson hoped that some sort of negotiated settlement could be achieved between the United States and Germany so that the United States could remain out of the war, could remain neutral. After the Germans sank a second passenger ship, the president intensified his negotiations. This second passenger ship carried no Americans. It was a ferry, English Channel ferry, ferrying people between Britain and France. So a smaller ship, as you can see. And this ship was called the Sussex. Now, this German submarine, as you can see, its torpedo blew the entire bow off the front of the ship. But this ship actually made it into port, so the number of deaths on board the Sussex were relatively small, particularly compared to the over 1,200 people killed on board the Lusitania. Nevertheless, it was a disturbing pattern. German submarines were attacking passenger ships. And so President Wilson sought to negotiate with the German government. Rather than having the United States enter the war at this time, President Wilson sought to negotiate with the German government and try to extract some sort of promise from them that this behavior would come to an end. And the promise that he got from the Germans became known as the Sussex Pledge. A pledge, a promise made by the German government to refrain from doing two things. Number one, the Germans promised that they would sink no neutral ships. They promised that German submarines would sink no neutral ships. So ships from neutral countries, like the United States. Now, that wouldn't have helped the people on board the Lusitania or the Sussex, because those were both British ships. So the second promise that was made by the Germans to President Wilson was that before sinking any ship, German submarine would surface and give warning so that the crew of that ship and any passengers could abandon ship, so that they could launch lifeboats and get away from the ship before it was torpedoed. Which sounds crazy, but when you think about it, at the time that the Germans agreed to this, it probably made reasonable amount of sense. You know, they probably said, well, our purpose in torpedoing ships is not to kill the crew or the passengers. Our purpose in torpedoing ships is to destroy the cargo, prevent that cargo from getting into the hands of the British and the French. And honestly, that didn't bother the United States, because by the time that cargo was being carried on board a British or French ship, it had already been paid for. It was the property of Britain or the property of France. And if the Germans wanted to destroy British or French property that had been purchased from American companies, that didn't affect the United States or our companies or our people in any negative way. So for the Germans, the promise that they made was, we won't attack any neutral ships. We will not allow our submarines to torpedo any neutral ships. So American ships are safe. And if our submarines are to torpedo any ships, first they will surface and give warning so that the crew and the passengers can abandon ship. Then we'll torpedo it, destroy it, along with the cargo, sinking the ship, to deprive the British and French of those products that they had purchased. So from the German perspective, all the American concerns should be taken care of. Germany won't torpedo any American ships because we're neutral. Germany won't be killing any more civilians because they'll be surfacing and giving warning. And that, President Wilson felt, was sufficient. And so President Wilson accepted the German promise made in the Sussex Pledge. And so even after the sinking of the Lusitania, the United States remained neutral. The United States did not join the war because of the sinking of the Lusitania. We remained neutral because of the Sussex Pledge made by the Germans in the spring of 1916. And President Wilson was actually running for re-election that year, that fall. And one of the main appeals that he made to the American people in trying to gain re-election was, he kept us out of war. and he was reelected. So it shows you that the American people, despite the fact that their opinion had turned against Germany, still were pretty committed to staying neutral, staying out of this war. And you can't blame them. Given what we saw in 1916, battles of the Somme, Battle of Verdun, and the horrific casualties suffered. Yes, staying out of this war, it seemed, was the smart thing to do, if you could do it. And Wilson, it seemed, had been able to do that by negotiating with the Germans. The problem is that the Germans almost immediately regretted making these promises. For one thing, now that they had promised not to attack any neutral ships, the British and French, instead of carrying merchandise like war materials purchased from American companies on their own cargo ships, now began to hire space on board American cargo ships. So American goods carried on American cargo ships were completely immune from German submarine attack because they were being carried on a ship of a neutral country, the United States. So that meant that those war materials purchased from American companies carried on American ships could flow freely to Britain and France. The other problem the Germans ran into was that as for the British and French ships, cargo ships, they now mounted deck guns on the decks of their cargo ships that covered up with a tarp. And when a German submarine surfaced to give warning to the crew that they were about to be torpedoed, the crew would run out, uncover the gun, and start blasting away at the German submarine. And like I said before, German submarines were not heavily armed. One good shot from that deck gun on board that cargo ship could sink a submarine and kill the crew. So very quickly, the German Naval Command regretted the promise that had been made to President Wilson. They regretted the Sussex Pledge. Germany was suffering. Its war effort was suffering because of it. And so by the fall of 1916, after President Woodrow Wilson was reelected, the German commanders went to the German civilian government and said, we can't go on like this. You've got to break the Sussex Pledge. Because of the Sussex Pledge, war materials made by American companies and purchased from American companies by the British and French are now flowing freely to Britain and France, and that's part of the reason we can't defeat them. And so the German government said, you want us to break the promise? Well, won't that bring the United States into the war? And the German commander said, yes, of course. But the United States, kind of like Britain, does not maintain a large army during times of peace. And it's true, we didn't. At that time, the U.S. Army only numbered 200,000 soldiers. It was the 18th largest army in the world. And, shoot, we just talked about all these battles, Battle of Verdun, Battle of the Somme. You have a million casualties in those battles. And the United States Army numbers only 200,000 men. So the German commanders told their government, look, yes, if we break the Sussex Pledge, the United States undoubtedly will join the war. But they will have to recruit an army big enough to fight this war. They will have to train an army. They will then have to transport that army across the Atlantic Ocean with our submarines attacking them the whole way. And then they can deploy that army in France. The German commanders told their government it will take the Americans at least a year to do that. It will take them a year to recruit the army, train the army, and transport it to France. It will be at least a year after the Americans declare war before we see large numbers of American soldiers fighting our troops in Western Europe on the Western Front. And so the German government said, okay, what's the benefit of violating the Sussex Pledge? And the German commander said, if you turn our submarines loose with no restrictions on what kind of ships they attack, when they attack them, letting us attack without warning, if you allow us to do what's called unrestricted submarine warfare, no restrictions, no rules, we can sink hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping every month, and we will choke off the flow of war materials from American companies to Britain and France. And as a result of that, the British and French will not be able to continue the war. So that by the time the Americans get their army recruited, trained, and transported, the war will be over. And the entry of the United States will not matter. So that was the logic of the German command, which they then sold to the German government for violating the Sussex Pledge and resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. And in the late fall of 1916, that is exactly what they did. The Germans resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning that their submarines would attack any ship at any time without warning. And they did. They sank British cargo ships, French cargo ships, and even though the United States was not in the war, American cargo ships too. Well, that, of course, ended whatever hopes President Wilson had of keeping the United States out of the war. The American public was now fully roused against Germany, and so was President Wilson. And so in April of 1917, as the German submarine attacks continued, President Wilson sought a declaration of war from the U.S. Congress. You studied the Constitution in 8th grade, you may have learned that the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. However, Congress, only Congress can declare war. So when the President believes the United States should be at war, the President conducts what's called a joint meeting of the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate, the full Congress. The President speaks to them, seeking a declaration of war and explaining why. And that's what President Wilson did in April of 1917. For what it's worth, Congress debated the issue for 4 days. But finally, they agreed with President Wilson's logic that Germany had in fact already become the enemy of the United States, was carrying out acts of war against our shipping. President Wilson had also argued that the United States must enter the war in order to help keep the world safe for democracy. And after 4 days of duking it out and fighting it out and discussing it and debating it, Congress agreed. So the United States declared war on Germany in April of 1917. As it turns out, the German command were right. It took more than a year in between this declaration of war and the actual arrival of large numbers of American soldiers on the Western Front in France. The U.S. declared war April 1917. Large numbers of U.S. troops did not arrive in France until June of 1918. It took more than a year. So the German commanders were right about that. The question was, were they also right about being able to then end the war before the United States joined? Now, my guess is that you kind of already know the answer to that question. If you don't, I guess I won't spoil it for you. But my guess is you already do know the answer to that. But that is a subject for another lesson, and we'll get there. So in our next lesson, we will bring an end to the First World War, one way or the other. So until then, I hope you're able to stay safe and stay healthy. And until we get to do the lesson that brings an end to World War I, take good care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.